The Xena had arrived in a flash of light and thunder, their massive ships hanging like ominous shadows above Earth's atmosphere. Captain McGuire stood at the command deck of the UN Space Council's flagship, watching the alien vessels blot out the stars. His jaw clenched with a mix of awe and unease. They were here, the unstoppable force, the conquerors of entire galaxies. For millennia, the Xena had spread across the cosmos, their society built on a singular principle: domination through strength. Physical power and technological superiority were the hallmarks of their empire, and any species that failed to meet their standards was crushed or assimilated. Now, their gaze had turned toward humanity, a relatively young species in comparison, but one that had already caught their attention. The Xena saw Earth as ripe for conquest, another planet to be absorbed into their ever-expanding dominion. "They've sent their terms," McGuire's communications officer, Lieutenant Joe, said, handing over a data pad. "An ultimatum. War or surrender." McGuire scanned the message, his brow furrowing at the cold efficiency of the words. The Xena offered no room for negotiation, no possibility for peace. They had never needed to. Their military might was unparalleled, their technology capable of decimating entire fleets in the blink of an eye. But what concerned McGuire most was their confidence. They believed themselves invincible, untouchable. To them, this was just another routine conquest, and humanity, in their eyes, stood no chance. "We need to respond," Joe urged. "The Council wants to know our next move." McGuire didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. The Xena were formidable, far beyond anything Earth had faced before. But where they saw weakness, he saw opportunity. They had never truly known defeat, never understood the weight of war's cost on a civilization's soul. They fought for supremacy, for glory, but they did not fight for survival. "Prepare a transmission," McGuire said at last, his voice firm. "I want a direct line to their leader." As Joe moved to comply, McGuire's gaze drifted back to the looming Xena ships. He knew what needed to be done. A direct confrontation would be suicide. Earth's defenses, though formidable by human standards, were laughably inadequate against the alien invaders. But brute strength wasn't the only way to win a war. History had taught McGuire that sometimes the strongest weapon wasn't a fleet of warships. It was knowledge. Minutes later, the screen flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of High Commander Salwar, the leader of the Xena forces. His armor gleamed with an eerie metallic sheen, and his eyes glowed with a cold, calculated intelligence. He regarded McGuire with the detached curiosity of a predator observing its prey. "Human," Salwar began, his voice deep and resonant. "You are Captain McGuire, I presume. Do you speak for your species?" McGuire straightened. "I do. And I understand you've issued us a challenge." Salwar's expression didn't change. "We have. You have two choices. Submit to our rule and become part of the Xena Empire, or resist and be destroyed." The ultimatum was delivered without emotion, as if the outcome was already determined. But McGuire saw the flaw in their arrogance. They knew nothing of humanity's resilience, its capacity to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. They assumed that technological superiority was the only measure of strength, but McGuire knew better. "We don't seek conflict," McGuire said calmly, "but we won't surrender either. Instead, I propose something different." Salwar's eyes narrowed slightly. "Different? We've studied your kind," McGuire continued. "We know you value strength above all else. But strength isn't just about force. It's about understanding the consequences of conflict. So, before you make your final decision, I'd like to show you something. Call it an education in the history of war." The Xena commander tilted his head, clearly intrigued. "You waste your time, Captain. No lesson in history will change what is inevitable." McGuire smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but I think you'll find that some wars are never worth fighting." Salwar's eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Very well. Humor us, human. Show us your history. It will not change your fate. The transmission cut off, and McGuire let out a slow breath. The first step had been taken, but the real challenge was only just beginning. He knew that convincing the Xener to rethink their ways would not be easy. They were a species bred for conquest, conditioned to see war as the ultimate expression of power. But McGuire had a different kind of power on his side. The truth of history, and in that truth lay humanity's greatest weapon. The Xener delegation stood in silence, their impassive faces reflecting the cold glow of the holographic screen before them. They were watching footage of a mushroom cloud rising over Japani City, the devastating crescendo of one of humanity's darkest moments. Captain McGuire stood at the forefront of the human delegation, observing the Xener closely. He needed them to feel something, anything, beyond their rigid belief in power. But the aliens remained as stone-faced as ever. "This," McGuire began, his voice steady but laced with underlying tension, "is the price of unchecked technological power." The image shifted to show the ruins of city, charred bodies, twisted metal, and endless devastation. The camera panned over a sea of rubble, where once there had been homes, schools, lives. Even now, decades later, McGuire found it hard to stomach. The hollow eyes of survivors flashed on the screen, their bodies scarred, their spirits shattered. His stomach churned, but he pressed on. He had to reach them. This is the aftermath of a single bomb. One weapon unleashed in the pursuit of total dominance. McGuire continued. Hundreds of thousands died in an instant, and many more suffered in the years that followed. Radiation poisoning, birth defects, the lingering ghosts of war. Is this what you call strength? Salwar, still looming in his polished armor, watched with faint interest. His species had known war for centuries, yet this was different. There was no honor in such destruction. He cast a glance toward his advisors, some of whom seemed equally disturbed, though they remained silent. "One weapon," Salwar echoed softly. "One event in your species' past. But what of the outcome? Did it not end your conflict?" "It ended one war," McGuire said, locking eyes with him. "But the cost of that war has echoed through generations. You see, victory through annihilation is no victory at all." He signaled, and the hologram shifted again, this time to scenes from the Vietnam War. Grainy footage of soldiers trudging through dense jungles, haunted by the invisible threat of guerrilla fighters. The Xener watched as napalm rained down, as villages were consumed in flames. The sounds of screaming, of chaos, filled the chamber. The Vietnam War, McGuire explained, was a different kind of conflict, not fought with overwhelming force, but with tactics that preyed on the mind, on endurance. Neither side emerged unscathed, and while technology shaped the battlefield, it was a human spirit, pushed to its breaking point, that bore the brunt of the suffering. A shot of American soldiers, their eyes hollow and weary, flashed across the screen. Next came images of protests, of young men burning draft cards and families torn apart by the moral questions surrounding the war. The Xener, though conditioned to value power, could not ignore the profound human cost. The images were raw, visceral, and undeniable. "Your wars seem chaotic," Salwar remarked, his voice betraying the smallest hint of discomfort. "Uncontrolled," McGuire nodded. "That's the nature of war, even with all the technology in the world. There's no control once it begins. Soldiers are not machines. War does not end on the battlefield. It lives in the minds of those who fight it, and in the lives of the innocent caught in its wake." The screen flickered again, this time revealing the iconic black and white footage of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear warheads being assembled, strategic maps laid out, and world leaders on the brink of pressing the button that would erase humanity. McGuire felt the weight of the moment return, the familiar chill of what nearly was. "This," he said, gesturing to the scene, "was the closest we came to total annihilation. The entire world poised on the edge of destruction, waiting for a single misstep." The Xener watched, their stony exteriors finally showing cracks of uncertainty. The notion of mutual destruction unsettled them. For a species that had always conquered through overwhelming power, the idea that two civilizations could destroy each other entirely was alien, literally. Salwar's expression hardened. And yet, you did not destroy yourselves. Why show us this? Maguire took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Because we learned something from that moment. We learned that no amount of power, no matter how vast, guarantees survival. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when not to use it. The room fell silent again. Maguire could feel the tension mounting as the Xener processed the enormity of what they had seen. The facade of invincibility they projected seemed to waver. They were no longer the supreme conquerors who believed every war was theirs to win. For the first time, they appeared vulnerable, not physically but philosophically. "We are not so different from you," Maguire said, his voice quieter now, more personal. "We, too, once believed that war was the only path to dominance. But we've learned painfully that it's a path that leads to destruction for everyone involved." Salwar's eyes narrowed, as if wrestling with a concept he'd never considered. "You speak of consequences, but consequences are for the weak. Then perhaps we're all weaker than we think," Maguire replied. "Even the strongest civilizations can fall under the weight of their own violence." The words hung in the air, a challenge of their own. Maguire waited. The battle, he knew, was far from over, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He just needed it to grow. The council chamber aboard the Xener flagship was dimly lit, its vast walls adorned with holographic depictions of the Xeners' countless victories, a monument to their conquests. Yet now, in the wake of humanity's historical revelations, the atmosphere was anything but triumphant. For the first time in centuries, the Xener High Command found themselves unsettled. The human captain's words lingered, haunting the room like a specter. High Commander Salwar stood at the head of the room, his usually commanding presence now tempered by an uncharacteristic silence. His subordinates exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for their leader to speak. But Salwar remained still, staring into the glowing table before him, his mind torn between his ingrained beliefs and the disturbing implications of what he had seen. "The humans, they are weak," General Qatar finally spoke, his voice laced with defiance. "Their wars are sloppy, chaotic, and unfocused. They lack the discipline of a truly superior species." "And yet," Salwar murmured, breaking his silence, "they survive." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Qatar's expression darkened, but he did not respond. The others remained quiet, unsure how to navigate the strange new territory they found themselves in. They were warriors, bred for conquest. Victory through strength was the only language they knew, the only path they had ever followed. But now, the concept of survival through restraint gnawed at them, foreign and unwelcome. "Survival," Salwar repeated, the word hanging in the air. "That is the true measure of strength. And yet, their survival is not born from conquest, but from endurance, from rebuilding." General Qatar straightened, his hands clenching into fists. "High Commander, we cannot let the words of these humans cloud our purpose. They are inferior. Their so-called victories are merely accidents of fate. Are they?" Salwar countered, his voice colder now. "You saw the same footage I did. Those wars could have ended their civilization. And yet, here they are, standing before us, defying us." A silence fell over the room once more. Salwar's gaze swept over the faces of his generals, noting the flickers of doubt that had begun to creep into their eyes. They had always believed that war was their ultimate purpose, that domination was their destiny. But now, for the first time, that belief felt incomplete. "It is troubling," Salwar continued, "that the humans possess something we do not. They understand the cost of war in ways we have never had to. They know the scars that conflict leaves behind, scars that go beyond the physical. We are stronger," Qatar insisted, though his voice faltered slightly. "We have never needed such understanding." "Perhaps," Salwar said, "because we've never been forced to face the consequences of our wars. Every enemy we've encountered has fallen before our might. Every battle we've fought has been a victory. But what if that is our weakness? The question, unthinkable just days ago, now hung heavily over the room. Salwer's words struck at the heart of what it meant to be Xener. To question their reliance on war was to question their very identity. I fear, Salwar continued, his voice softer now, almost reflective, that we may have grown complacent. We have always believed that power lies in destruction. But what if true strength lies in what comes after? One of the younger commanders, a warrior named Jarek, finally spoke up, his voice tentative. High Commander, you suggest that we have been wrong. Salwar met his gaze, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had never doubted his people's path before, but the human captain had shown him something he could not ignore. A future where the strongest civilizations crumbled under the weight of their own violence. I suggest, Salwar said slowly, that there is more to strength than we have been taught. The humans have endured countless wars, but they have also rebuilt. They have learned from their mistakes, evolved in ways we have not. That is a form of strength we may lack. The room was thick with tension, the air charged with the realization that their centuries-old belief system was no longer as unshakable as it once seemed. The Xena had always viewed themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, but the humans, flawed, chaotic, and fragile as they were, had shown them something new. Survival was not just about conquest. It was about adaptation. Qatar's face twisted in frustration, but he did not speak again. The other commanders remained silent as well, grappling with the dissonance between what they had always believed and the uncomfortable truth laid before them. Jarek, his brow furrowed in thought, asked the question that weighed on all of them. What do we do now? Salwar paused, his eyes narrowing as the gravity of their situation became clear. The decision they faced was unprecedented. For the first time, the Xena were confronted not with an enemy to conquer, but with the possibility of a future beyond war. We must consider, Salwar said at last, his voice heavy, what it means to be strong. Perhaps our strength lies not in continuing down the same path, but in evolving, just as the humans have. The council remained silent, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. The Xena, once so certain of their superiority, now stood at a crossroads, uncertain of their place in the universe. Captain Maguire stood at the helm of the UN Space Council's flagship, his gaze fixed on the massive Xena fleet looming in the distance. Days had passed since the historic meeting, but the weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on him. Humanity had faced impossible odds, a challenge from a civilization far more advanced, a species bred for domination. And yet, here they stood, on the precipice of something far greater than victory. A chime interrupted his thoughts. Lieutenant Joe's voice crackled through the comms, barely concealing her excitement. Sir, we received a transmission from the Xener. High Commander Salwar himself is requesting to speak with you. Maguire nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Put him through. The screen flickered to life, revealing Salwar, his once impenetrable armor now almost dull in the soft glow of the communication link. The Xener leader's expression was unreadable, but something had changed. The cold certainty that had once marked his every word was gone, replaced by something far more complex. Respect, perhaps, or even humility. Captain Maguire, Salwar began, his voice measured but lacking its usual commanding edge. We have reviewed all that you have shown us, the destruction, the suffering, and, most importantly, the strength your species has demonstrated in surviving its own conflicts. You have opened our eyes. Maguire felt the tension in his body ease slightly. This was the moment they had been working toward. But he knew better than to relax just yet. What have you decided? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Salwar exhaled, his shoulders sinking just a fraction. We believe that strength was solely defined by power, by the ability to conquer, to destroy. But you've shown us a different kind of strength, one born from resilience, from adaptation. We've seen how even the mightiest civilizations can fall, not from external threats, but from within. And it is because of this that we have come to a conclusion. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. McGuire's fingers tightened around the edge of the console, waiting for the Xeno leader's next words. "We have long considered ourselves the apex species of the universe," Salwar continued, "but we realize now that we were mistaken. True strength lies in knowing the value of peace, in understanding the cost of war. You, humans, possess a wisdom we have never sought, a strength we have never valued. And because of this, we declare humanity the true apex species of the universe." McGuire's breath caught in his throat. He had anticipated many outcomes, some far more dire. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "Do you understand what you're saying?" he asked, his voice low, almost disbelieving. Salwar's glowing eyes met his, and for the first time, McGuire saw something almost human in them. "We understand," the Xena commander replied. "The path of war has defined us for millennia, but it has also blinded us. We can no longer see our future through the lens of conquest alone. You have shown us that there is another way. We wish to learn from you, to evolve beyond what we are." The weight of the declaration settled over the bridge like a thick fog. The entire human delegation stood in stunned silence, their disbelief mirrored in their wide eyes and slackened jaws. Captain McGuire, though reeling from the magnitude of what had just transpired, knew he needed to keep his composure. This was a fragile moment. "We accept your decision," McGuire said carefully, searching for the right words. "And we will help you, just as we have helped ourselves, find a path beyond war. We have made our mistakes, but we've also learned. Together, we can forge a future that doesn't rely on destruction to define strength." A silence followed as Salwar digested the words, his head inclining slightly in a gesture that could almost be seen as reverence. "Then it is settled," he said. "We will withdraw our fleets and begin discussions on a new alliance, one built not on fear, but on mutual growth." As the transmission ended, McGuire let out a long breath, the tension finally leaving his body. Around him, the bridge erupted in quiet celebrations, the weight of impending war lifted from their shoulders. But McGuire's thoughts remained solemn. They had averted destruction today, but the future was still uncertain. Guiding the Xenu away from their long-held path would not be easy, but it was a responsibility humanity had earned. Lieutenant Joe approached, her eyes wide with awe. "Did we just win?" McGuire turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't know if this was a victory," he replied, "but it's a beginning.